Glad to see everybody. I'm Melinda Phillips, and this story is called The Escapists. So, Jim had a bug, and by a bug, I don't mean that he had a stomach thing going on. I don't mean he had a computer virus. The bug that Jim had was a VW Beetle, a 1966 VW Beetle to be precise. It was a red interior, white paint, brand spanking new 1966 VW Beetle. It was his first car, so it was his pride and joy. He loved to tinker on it. He loved to clean the interior. He loved to wash it and wax it and all the 9 yards. And he was a decent driver. And that's important to know. This was Ogden's boy, so he was taught about all the things. He was taught about the inner workings of the car and what happened when you went too fast, too slow, braked too hard, all of that. Now, the 1966 VW Beetle was a stick shift, which is obvious, but it's important to our story. So on the night in question, it was a snowy, cold night in Kansas City. And it was one of those very like Missouri winter nights where the temperature dropped really fast, which meant that it was snowy, but it was also really, really slick. The ice was everywhere. It happened overnight. And on that night, Jim was on his way home from play practice. And he was driving over by Swope Park area. He had his cousin Ray in the passenger seat with him. And they were on their way home. It was late. He was taking it slow. He was doing everything he needed to do. He was paying attention. And as they eased down the hill of Meyer Boulevard, they hit a patch of black ice. Now, at the very end of this hill was this roundabout. So this was already kind of a sticky situation, to be sure. They were on a downward slope. They were going to hit an odd angle. Jim was this 16-year-old boy trying to do everything that he knew to do. He grabbed the wheel. He didn't brake too hard. He watched all of his surroundings. But the one thing he did that he shouldn't have done was that he hit the clutch and he killed the engine. So in the middle of this ride, they were sliding, they couldn't stop, and now the engine was dead. And the thing to know about 1966 VW Beetles, most of the 1960s VW Beetles, is that their engine is in the back of the vehicle, which affects the weight distribution and how a car moves, of course. So as they're sliding, they're panicking. And as they're sliding into this roundabout, the back of the car starts to swing around until they're in this weird perpendicular angle going through this roundabout. It's not great. And as they're experiencing this, Jim is thinking to himself, this is pretty bad, but at the very least, I'm probably just going to hit the curb, maybe take a tumble, and nobody but Ray is here to see this embarrassing moment. And that is when Ray looked up. And then Jim looked up and over through the passenger window, and they realized that as they were inching into this roundabout, they were sliding. They were inching closer and closer to a pair of headlights. And those headlights belonged to a police car. Some silence is like a cathedral. It's warm and it wraps you in peace and this glow of waiting. This was not that. This was a silence that was panicked and tight and humid. They had no idea what was going to happen, but they also knew that If they hit this police car, they had no way to explain this. They were in big, big trouble. And so they watched in horror with their eyes the size of saucers as they inched closer and closer to these headlights, having no idea what was going to happen. Closer and closer and closer. And as they slid, they started to slow down little by little by little until finally they slowed to a crawl. They didn't know what else to do, so they scrunched up their eyes tight, just waiting for that inevitable crunch and bump of a bumper. And they stopped. Ray opened one eye, and then he opened another eye. And then he nudged Jim real quick and pointed in silence. And right before them were the headlights. And they had managed to miss the bumper. If you got out of the car, you could not even slide a hand in between the bumper and the side of the VW Bug. They were that close. They waited. And they waited. They didn't move a muscle. They didn't breathe. They were certain that any second there was going to be movement inside that car. He was going to come out. He was going to arrest them or give them a ticket or call their parents or any number of really horrible, terrible things. And then nothing happened. Ray's eyes were pinpointed on the silhouette in that police car, and it didn't move. It didn't turn around. Everything was quiet and everything was still. Jim and Ray took a small breath, and then they looked at each other. And then slowly, Jim reached for the keys in the ignition, and carefully, softly, he turned the key, started the car, and then they flinched because they were sure that the policeman inside would notice the noise. Nothing happened. Jim put the car in gear, put his hands on the wheel, and slowly started to drift into the circle around the police car, around the block, and towards home. They could not believe what they had just gotten away with. They were certain every mile home, they were certain that there was going to suddenly be sirens behind them, realizing what they had done, realizing what had just happened. And with each passing block, there was just silence and the sound of them breathing, taking these ragged breaths, trying not to panic. Finally, when they were sure that all was clear, Ray looked at Jim, and curiosity came over his face, and he said, Jim, what do you think would happen if that policeman got out of his car just then and looked around the back and saw all of these tire tracks just sporadically behind his car? And Jim said, I don't know. And then they burst out laughing, and they drove the rest of the way home. And they tucked themselves into bed, and they never spoke about it again until it was time for Jim to start teaching his daughter how to drive in the snow so that she could slide properly. Anyway, that is the story of how my dad and my Uncle Ray once evaded the cops.